for today's lecture, what I want to talk about is America and our growing involvement in Vietnam. During the Cold War, this becomes kind of a centerpiece or emblematic of America in the Cold War, and we slowly become increasingly involved in Vietnam through the late 1940s, 50s, and into the 1960s. When we start our discussion of the Vietnam War, I usually like to show students a map just so you can get a picture of where Vietnam is in the world and get a little bit of its background. If you look at this picture on the slide, China is up here. The Korean Peninsula is up here to the right, to kind of the northeast. And then down here on this peninsula, you see countries like Thailand and Laos and Cambodia. And then Vietnam is kind of this S-shaped country here on the coast of the South China Sea and the Gulf of Tonkin. It borders China, and that will come into play as the war proceeds. And then it is neighbored by Laos and Cambodia. And there's this little line here called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and this will come into play later. The important thing to know, at least for the start of our story here, is that this peninsula used to be called Indochina, and it was a colony of France. Dating back into the 1800s, France had reached their arm across the globe here to the South Pacific, and these areas were colonies of France. America's involvement in Vietnam begins when Vietnam is trying to fight or pressure or rebel for their independence. And we are first going to get involved by trying to help the French hold on to their colony in Indochina. The problem, as you can see with the title of this slide, is France is going to abandon Vietnam. They're going to step back and they're going to release their colony. But America is going to step in and continue to, in some senses, try to control the destiny of Vietnam. Down here in the bottom, you can see the mention of this place, Dien Bien Phu. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu, it's talking about 1953. By 1954 is the final defeat of the French. And the Battle of Dien Bien Phu is going to see the French leave. And from here on out, the situation in Vietnam is going to be America's problem, so to speak. Let's see if I can skip this up now. Oh, too far. On this next slide, we see the leader, specifically at the outset of North Vietnam, but eventually of Vietnam as a whole, and his name is Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh's ultimate dream is an independent Vietnam. He is a Vietnamese nationalist who wants Vietnam to be independent. On the one hand, you say, so what's so wrong with that? Why is America going to get in the way to try to block that? The problem was, from America's point of view, he was a communist. We were fearful in the Cold War, after France leaves and Vietnam wants to be independent, that they will become a communist state. Truthfully, Ho Chi Minh wanted the United States to be their ally. You can read through this slide a little more detailed on your own time. But Ho Chi Minh, he wanted the United States as an ally, and he phrased a lot of the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence like the U.S. Declaration of Independence. But the problem was America was not going to endorse an independence movement that would result in a new communist nation. For America, we tended to see all communist governments the same. And we didn't make distinctions so much between the Soviet Union or China or North Vietnam. And so in the 1950s, America is going to step in and in a sense, block Vietnamese independence because we don't want to see them become communist. Part of America's thinking is what's known as the domino theory. And the domino theory, several students had mentioned this in one of our assignments already, but the domino theory is a variation of the general containment policy. Containment, if you'll remember, is that the United States does not want to see communism spread. And as you see these dominoes kind of lined up in these various pictures, the thinking was that if one country became communist, then their neighbor would become communist and their neighbor and so on. And eventually there would be a ripple effect around the world. And again, you say, what's the big deal about communism being spread around the world? You have to remember in the Cold War, two superpowers are battling for whose ideas will get to, in a sense, influence or have the greatest influence in the world. And we saw the spreading of communism as a spreading of Soviet influence and Soviet Union ideas. The temporary solution in the 1950s was to temporarily split Vietnam into North and South. We split them. This was part of what was called the Geneva Convention at the 17th parallel. And North Vietnam, from here on out, we'll refer to them as our communist enemies, and South Vietnam will be referred to as our non-communist allies. And America is trying to prevent North Vietnamese communism spreading to South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh's dream was a united Vietnam, all communists, and the limited goal of the United States in what will become the Vietnam War is the preservation of democracy and non-communism in South Vietnam. Where we really see America's involvement start to pick up is in the Kennedy years. Truman had given money and verbal support to the French. Eisenhower was the first president to send American troops to support the independence of South Vietnam. But Kennedy will move America's support for South Vietnam even further. He supports a leader in South Vietnam named Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem was not a communist. And for America and for Kennedy, that was enough for us to give him our support. But just because he wasn't a communist, that doesn't mean he was good either. In fact, there was rumors of corruption around him. And just from a status standpoint, he was not supported by the people in South Vietnam. He was a wealthy Catholic elitist, and he's the leader of South Vietnam. But the majority of South Vietnam's population were Buddhist peasants. They were working class, not of status and means. Often they were rice farmers and had different occupations and different views on life than Diem. And here is America supporting, giving money, sending troops, propping up a leader that the people that we are trying to protect or defend don't even relate to or support. This is going to be a problem. This is a very disturbing picture here. This is a Buddhist South Vietnamese monk who has committed a public suicide. This is called self-immolation. And you can see other monks have kind of blocked off the streets. And this monk has come out and set himself on fire as a public martyr, as a form of protest against Diem. Supposedly, or hearsay was that when President Kennedy saw this photo and realized that we were supporting somebody that the South Vietnamese people clearly were protesting against, willing to do a public suicide as a statement of protest against them, he grasped his head and wondered what we had gotten ourselves into. Kennedy, in the early 60s, increased American troop levels from 1,000 to 16,000. Now, these troops were known as advisors. These weren't troops that we had sent to Vietnam to fight. So we might not call it a war yet, but Kennedy was definitely increasing America's military presence in Vietnam. Now, another note, Diem was assassinated in 1963, just before Kennedy was. And at this point, our new president, Lyndon Johnson, is stepping into a situation where we are a guarantor nation. We're trying to guarantee the independence of a nation, but We don't really have an answer as to how to do that. And the person that we had been supporting has been removed. And we're going to have to establish a whole new policy in Vietnam. And finally, for this last slide of America's increasing involvement, I want you to see the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. President Johnson came into office after President Kennedy had been assassinated. So he's going to become president in 1963. And by 1964, you're going to see a major turning point in America's involvement. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. This takes place in August of 1964. An American ship, the USS Maddox, was fired upon and then perhaps fired upon a second time a couple days later. And as a result, LBJ, President Johnson, gets Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions, which is essentially allowed Johnson to take all necessary measures to repel an armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The questions surrounding the Gulf of Tonkin incident is, why was the USS Maddox, this is the trajectory here, in North Vietnamese waters? These are where the attacks took place, or supposedly took place, on August 2nd and August 4th, 1964. Why had President Johnson sent that ship into these waters? People wondered, not at the time, but many years later, did President Johnson manufacture a war? The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was not an official declaration of war, but it did give President Johnson essentially a blank check to increase troop levels. It's at this point where we might start to really refer to it as the Vietnam War. Some historians have called the Vietnam War America's longest war, and they trace our support for the French back to 1948 and fast forward all the way up to the end of the Vietnam conflict in 1973. And they say this war lasted over 2 decades. Other historians maybe take a more narrow view and say the war really begins with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964. Either way, this is a turning point. America's support for South Vietnam and our troop levels and combat forces will increase. In just a few years, American troop levels in Vietnam will go from 16,000 to over 500,000. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about that escalation and how the war played out in the 1960s. Thanks for watching.